Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dean Cohen, and I'm a member of Socialist Resurgence. And welcome to this Socialist Resurgence webinar on the life and legacy of one of the most important figures on the American left, James Patrick Cannon. Jim Cannon was a member of the IWW. He was a founding member of the American Communist Party, and of course, a founder and longtime guiding light of the American Trotskyist movement. Today, we are pleased and proud to have with us Bryan Palmer. Bryan has just completed the second of his three-volume biography of Jim Cannon. Bryan received his PhD in 1977 from State University of New York at Rochester and is now Canada Research Chair in the Department of Canadian Studies at Trent University in Ontario, Canada. His 2013 book on the 1934 Minneapolis Teamsters strike, Revolutionary Teamsters, is one of my favorite books of the last couple of years. Just as a way of introduction, one of my good friends and comrades, who was in the midst of a very hard-fought union organizing drive of hotel workers, told me that during the organizing drive, every morning when he would wake up and every evening before he'd go to bed at night, he would read parts of Bryan's bio of Cannon to help him relieve the stresses of the organizing drive, and I think that's a great testament. At the end of the presentation, we'll be taking questions on the Facebook comments, which will be relayed to the panelists. So right now, let's welcome our guest, our special guest speaker, Bryan Palmer.
Well, thanks so much, Dean, and to John and Evan and all the people in Socialist Resurgence who've made this possible. I think I've been talking with comrades in the group for a couple of years, and I was supposed to come down, I think, a while ago before the pandemic, but I could not make it. And so I'm delighted you've stuck with me, and I'm here today. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I really want to give you a preview in some senses of the second volume of my kind of now three-volume work on James Cannon. It's a massive book. It's about 800 pages. It should be out in 2021 with the Historical Materialism book series published by Brill. It'll be outrageously expensive, but the Haymarket paperback should come a year after. What this volume does is it really looks at Cannon and the emergence of American Trotskyism in the 1928 to 1938 years. So it's a 10-year period. And it's a 10-year period that's been mainly written about and discussed in terms of the American revolutionary left with respect to the Communist Party. And what I hope to do in discussing Cannon and really the emergence of Trotskyism is to put the left opposition back into the history of this period. I think this is an amazingly important decade and in some senses very salient for our own times. And Cannon's role in it, I think, gives us a lot of lessons, a lot of benchmarks, and a lot of guidelines in terms of how to function in the trade union movement, how to function in terms of the regroupment of the revolutionary left in times of turmoil and difficulty, and really how to maintain a kind of continuity of revolutionary perspective. I think something that isn't appreciated enough when one looks at the history of Trotskyism in the United States and its birth really in 1928 is how difficult a moment this was to actually sustain an oppositional current in the revolutionary left that maintained the principles and program of the early Revolutionary Communist International as it was degenerating under Stalinism. Really, when the Cannon, Max Shachtman, Martin Aburn, and Rose Carstner broke from the Communist International in 1928, they really faced an uphill battle. They built a coherent organization of probably 120 to 150 people over the course of late 1928, 1929, and into 1930. But they faced in their opposition to the Communist Party of the United States and to the degenerating Communist International based in Moscow, they faced, of course, an immense uphill struggle to sort of chip away at the hegemonic place of the Comintern internationally and the Communist Party USA on the revolutionary left. And all of those figures pretty much who formed the sort of backbone of this revolutionary Trotskyist opposition in this period, in this early period, had really spent many, many years in the communist movement. Cannon, whose left history went back to joining the Socialist Party and then the Industrial Workers of the World, and then back into the Socialist Party, and then founding the Communist Party in 1921, really had to give up a lot to lead what was a struggling and always marginal revolutionary current. And in these very opening years, it was exceedingly difficult for the Trotskyists, who formed themselves as a left opposition, an external opposition, if you will, to the Communist Party, orienting to the Communist Party, orienting to the Comintern internationally with Trotsky's international left opposition, trying to win back the Comintern and the Communist Party in the USA to a revolutionary perspective, and to adherence to the original tenets of the Lenin and Trotsky orientation to world revolution, as opposed to the Stalinist orientation to building socialism in one country. And as they posed themselves as a left opposition, they ran immediately into the difficulty, a twin difficulty, of A, the collapse of the American economy in the Great Depression in 1929, and the left lurch of Stalinism into the third period. So while they were trying to appeal to Communist Party members as a left critique of Stalinism, Stalinism lurched to the left. This made it exceedingly difficult to win members away from the Communist Party, which they were dedicated to doing up until about 1933-34. And I'll talk briefly later about why that shift occurred. So the Great Depression cut the ground underneath the possibilities of mobilizing workers at first, for a number of reasons, not the least of which was that in the trade unions, struggles took very much a defensive rather than offensive turn. Strikes were very difficult to win. It was very difficult to organize. And compound that difficulty with the fact that this left also most of these original Trotskyists actually unemployed. Many of them had been full-time party functionaries in the Communist Party. Their wages and salaries and jobs and material well-being was gone. And those who had jobs in industry found themselves very precariously employed or unemployed. And you add to this the fact that the Communist Party, much stronger, much bigger, appeared to be in its ultra-left turn in the third period, really having a kind of stranglehold over the politics of the revolutionary left. And so for the first years, after the kind of enthusiasm of establishing their paper, the Militant, drawing some people to their ranks, the Trotskyist movement in the United States went into, in the early 30s, what Cannon later described as the dog days, very difficult times. Recruits were rare, and in a period when nothing seemed to be happening and breaking positively for these Trotskyists. Factionalism internally boiled up. Shachtman, Aburn, Morris Spector in Canada, and others turned very much against Cannon. His allies tended to be the Dunn brothers and Carl Skoglund in Minneapolis, Arnie Swabaka a Chicago militant. But for the most part, by the early 30s, Trotskyism appeared to be on the skids, and it was in a very, very precarious state. I would say the movement showed sort of great perseverance, and it was Trotsky and the international left opposition who constantly tried to draw the factionalism back into a more sustained orientation, and to elevate principles and program to a status above the personal antagonisms and difficulties which often seem to be tearing the early organization apart. And of course, not only did the Trotskyists face this, they faced, and they never anticipated the depths to which this would go. They faced hooliganism, thuggery, violence from their former comrades in the Stalinizing Communist Party of the USA. And whenever they would try to break into the organizations of the unemployed and put forward their program, whenever they mounted attempts to organize unions, whenever they fought to put forward their views at forums to sort of, raise before the membership of the Communist Party their actual positions, they were often faced with physical violence. And so it was a very bleak period. Now, what brought them out of this was, in some senses, a shift in the political terrain in 1933-34, as well as their, of course, long-standing perseverance. In Minneapolis, for instance, the Dunn brothers and Skoglund had been organizing in the coal yards for years. They had gone back before they were Trotskyists, but they had been developing, a presence in the transportation industry that would, of course, serve them very well in the breakthroughs in 1934. In 1933-34, the Depression lifted slightly, and workers began to mobilize. And they began to mobilize in ways that suggested the need to organize the unorganized, to crack open new industries, to break down the old craft union isolations of the skilled from the unskilled and semi-skilled and mass production workers. And there was talk well before the formation of the CIO later in the 30s. There was much talk of industrial unionism, which had always been a major plank in communist organizing in the 20s, for instance. And in 1933-34, this upturn in class struggle meant that more workers were mobilizing. There was more possibilities for groups like the Communist League of America, as the Trotskyists were known, to intervene in class struggles, opportunities that had been virtually impossible earlier in the decade. And you combine that with the fact that there was also mass mobilizations emerging around the question of the rise of fascism in Europe. And in both of these areas, it was possible for the Trotskyists to intervene and pose against the Communist Party and the Communist International their politics. So, for instance, instead of the third period sectarianism, isolationism, and ultra-leftism of the Communist Party, which said we must organize our own revolutionary unions, and to hell with the AFL, and any united front work in the unions with the Socialist Party or any other left-wing group. That was all. They were all social fascists and needed to be basically marginalized and defeated. The Trotskyists said no. We must organize inside the AFL. We must build revolutionary currents, and we must struggle for workers' victories in these difficult times. And also, the Trotskyists could point to the disastrous policies of the Communist International in Germany, in particular. Although this was also question was also raising its head in Spain and in Italy, Mussolini. Basically the third period's isolationism, for the Comintern, meant that Hitler was essentially given a free rein to defeat the left, to wipe out the communists, and then also to move very decisively against a very powerful and entrenched social democratic workers movement, to break the back of that, so that the path to fascist fascist victory was cleared. And this was, of course, a policy that the Trotskyists could actually recruit members out of the Communist Party on, and recruit other leftists who were moving to the left. So there were gains registered massively on the question of fascism, but also in the trade unions and in the workers' movement. The two areas of great advance or three areas really of advance for the Trotskyists in 1933 and 34 in the workers' movements, where they made inroads into the progressive miners' movement in Illinois. And again, Cannon was pivotal in this. He spoke in the mine fields. He'd been speaking in them since 1918, when he was arrested as part of the sort of repression of the immediate post-Russian Revolution Palmer raids era. He had a reputation in the coal fields, and he was a great working class orator and speaker, and galvanized workers there. The mainstay of the Trotskyist presence, however, in the progressive miners in Illinois was a figure named Jerry Allard, who was always back and forth and wavering on whether he was a Trotskyist or whether he was more of a social democrat in the Socialist Party tradition. And the Cannon and others placed a great deal of faith in Allard, trying to win him over and secure him and basically educate and train him in the principles of revolutionary politics and the trade union. It was never an entirely successful endeavor, and so the work in the progressive miners movement, in some senses, didn't pan out the way Cannon and others wanted it to. But they did learn very valuable lessons about building, for instance, women's auxiliaries in male-dominated industries and the vital role that they could play. This was pioneered in the progressive miners movement, where women's auxiliaries in the coal fields were incredibly important in sustaining class struggle and in labor defense campaigns and mobilizations. The Trotskyists also had a breakthrough in 1934 in the hotel sector, where a somewhat mercurial element, B.J. Field, originally known as Max Gould, got springboarded into basically a position of prominence in the hotel sector because of his involvement in the Communist League of America and his Trotskyist affiliations. And he aligned with a series of Greek agitators. He was a very learned academic figure, spoke a number of languages, including French, which endeared him to the French chefs in many of the more prestigious New York City hotels. Again, like Allard, the struggle to assimilate Field to the politics of revolutionary Trotskyism was never successful. He led this strike, although Cannon, Hugo Oehler, one of Cannon's trade union allies, and other figures in the Trotskyist movement played a fundamental role in the hotel strike, particularly as agitators and advisors to the union. But Field essentially led the struggle into a defeat. He could never be kind of won away from sort of placing far too much faith in arbitrators, labor boards, and the state in general, which Cannon worked very hard to kind of win him away from, but not in the end to any much success. The great victory of 1934, of course, was the Minneapolis Teamsters strikes, where in the midst of a depression, against as stalwart a group of reactionary employers as it's possible to imagine in the Citizens Alliance, and well organized, and had been the Citizens Alliance had kept Minneapolis an open shop town throughout the 1920s, and against a very reactionary hierarchy and officialdom in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, led by Dan Tobin, and against local government and police forces who were absolutely reactionary, and against a farmer labor governor who appeared to speak on behalf of the workers and in favor of the workers. The Dunn brothers, Skoglund, Farrell Dobbs, and others led 3 strikes, not 1 strike, but 3 strikes over the course of 1934, in February, in July, and again in August. And they defeated all of these forces and won a resounding victory. They brought a union, a craft union, in the Teamsters considered themselves a craft, that had only organized drivers. They created a union that grew between 1933 and 1934 from a membership of no more than 150 to a membership in September of 1934 of over 7,000. And they did this by fighting as well the Communist Party, which was constantly undermining them and basically trying to scuttle any hopes that the Teamsters, led by these revolutionary Trotskyists, had of securing a victory. So this was an immense achievement, and it really put Trotskyists on the map. And all of this was done, as I said, in challenging not only employers and the state, but the Communist Party. And it's, again, it was in 1934, the third period was on its way down, and they were moving towards the Popular Front, which would finally be, proclaimed, and put into practice in the later 30s. But they were also battling, all kinds of elements. This really, at the same time that this was going on, the workers' movement across the United States was actually beginning to mobilize and bring itself out of the doldrums of the Great Depression. And another left current that was organizing in 1934 was led by A.J. Muste, a progressive, a socialist who was moving with the current of the times in a revolutionary direction. And the Musteites in the American Workers' Party had led a major class struggle in Toledo as well, the Toledo Auto Light strike. And in some senses then, these victories brought these two groups together, and there was a fusion of the American Workers' Party and the Communist League of America opposition in 1935. Now, the groundwork of this was not just laid in the struggle at the point of production in terms of workers' mobilizations and trade unionism, which was, however important that was, it was also made possible by the fact that finally in 1933-34, Trotsky himself grasped that the left opposition that he had formed and that Cannon and others were leading in the United States could no longer realistically consider itself an external opposition oriented to winning the Communist Party and the Communist International back to revolutionary politics. The writing had been on the wall on this for a while, but the really telling point was the rise of fascism in Germany and the failure of the Stalinist Comintern to actually create united fronts of all left and progressive forces to fight the rise of fascism. And once this became very apparent that the Stalinized, thoroughly by this point, Stalinized Communist International and its parties like the Communist Party USA around the world were no longer able to engage in activities that would actually thwart fascism, it was clear that this was no longer a revolutionary movement. So at this point, Trotsky decided that it was time to break from the orientation that you had to address yourselves to the Communist International and the Communist movement. You had to instead create a new international, a new revolutionary Fourth International, that would be an alternative and a revolutionary counter opposition in some senses to the Stalinized Communist International based in Moscow. And this paved the way then for orienting towards a wider left and towards orienting towards mass work in the unions, mass struggles, and it made it possible for the fusion with the Mustyites. It also laid the foundations for Trotsky to develop what he called the French turn in Europe, which was a turn, again, into more mass organizations of the left, and in particular in France, to orient towards the Socialist Party, which had a very large membership, and which Trotsky saw opportunities for an entry into the Socialist Party, so that militants within it who were moving to the left under the pressures of the Great Depression, and who were moving to the left under the understandings that Stalinism really was now a break on revolutionary possibilities in all kinds of mobilizations, particularly around fascism, and particularly and obviously around the struggle in Spain, the Spanish Civil War. After the fusion with the Mustyites and in some senses the amalgamation of these two groups, there was much discussion about an entry into the Socialist Party of America. Now, the Socialist Party of America at this time was certainly probably not as significant a force in the United States politics as the Socialist Party of France was in France. There was no chance it was going to form a government, but it had, of course, a mass base that far exceeded that of Trotskyism, even as it was, in fact, in decline. And many youth, particularly young college students, but also young workers, were drawn to the possibilities that Norman Thomas, the leader of the Socialist Party, seemed to play in the electoral arena. In 1932, he'd achieved, for instance, a fairly substantial electoral vote. The Trotskyists saw that that by entering into the Socialist Party, they could bring themselves in contact with masses of youth and workers who were basically moving with the times in a revolutionary direction, and that they could perhaps recruit them, or even perhaps there was a thought, and this gets into how one approaches entries, they could possibly take over the Socialist Party. Now, what Cannon did, and this was, I think, Cannon had played a fundamental role in advising the Trotskyists in their strike activities in Illinois, in the coal mining sector, in the hotel sector in New York, and in Minneapolis. But it was in orchestrating the party building of this period, and particularly in the entry in the Socialist Party, where he ended up, I think, playing his most distinguished and most distinct role. Most of the Trotskyists, even when they had been involved in the factionalism of the early 1930s, probably would have seen their orientation towards the trade unions to be fairly similar. There might be differences, but really the differences between Cannon and people like Max Shachtman and James Burnham, who came into the Trotskyist movement with the fusion with the Mustyites, and others, the difference between Cannon's perspective on entry into the Socialist Party and the other Trotskyists was actually highly significant. The reason was that, and we must remember that how to do an entry, there was no playbook on this. There was no guidelines on this. There was no actual blueprint for entryists to follow. The idea was you would go in and you would work within them, and you would draw people to your politics, win people over to your politics. But how this was to be done, and how you would negotiate an entry where you were definitely going to run into opposition from more right-wing elements in these established social democratic parties. This was something that Trotsky in France had not really envisioned, and that the Americans had to sort of play it by ear. And what became central in the Trotskyist entry into the Socialist Party, which happened over the course of 1936, and created a great deal of factionalism again within the Trotskyist milieu. There were those who were always opposed to doing the entry. The main group that broke from Cannon and made their exit from the Trotskyist movement over this was a group led by Hugo Oehler, who really drifted into sectarianism and a refusal to, basically break out of the boundaries of a kind of self-enclosed, small, but pure Trotskyist movement. Oehler had many talents, and he had done extremely good work in trade union organizing and in the hotel workers' strike. But he broke from Cannon and the Trotskyists in 1936 over this issue of entry. And Cannon had been part of the negotiations of the entry of the left oppositionists, and now in the fused Workers' Party, the Mustyites and the Cannonites, who came together in 1935 in the fusion. He had played a key role with Shachtman and with others in negotiating with the leading figures in the Socialist Party in New York City. And he had been increasingly, how should I say, alienated from this leading layer of the Socialist Party. He found them overbearing. He found their demands, which they demanded that the Trotskyists enter the Socialist Party without their press. They give up everything, that they come in as individuals, not as a group. They were never given any organizers' posts. They were basically locked out. Cannon found this distasteful in the extreme, but he thought it was necessary to go in, do the entry. And increasingly, he became disaffected with essentially the leadership of the Socialist Party, who he distrusted and who he found repugnant. Others in the milieu in New York, Trotskyists, like old-time Trotskyists like Shachtman and newly arrived Trotskyists like Burnham, they thought that the way to do the entry was basically to negotiate with the left wing of the hierarchy in the Socialist Party, constantly to try to win favor with them, to basically avoid criticisms of them, and to essentially, create discussion groups with them that they were always going to come out on the short end of the stick. Cannon eventually said, no, this is not the way to do it. And the reason he found his way to a different politics, which Trotsky also embraced, was that he went, basically he'd had enough of New York and he headed out on the road. He went to Minneapolis, where he was, advising his comrades there on their work in the trade unions. And then he went to California. And he basically said that the way we need to do the entry is to forget about negotiating with the top. We need to work in the Socialist Party as militant with our program, and we need to build the Socialist Party, the ranks of the Socialist Party. And we need to fight the fights. We need to support electorally the SP in its campaigns, and he did. He spoke on behalf of Norman Thomas in the 1936 election campaign. But he also built Socialist Party activity at the base. He spoke endlessly at forums. He built locals, and he created a very close relationship for Socialist Party activists with the leadership of the Sailors Union in the Pacific on the West Coast. He created a newspaper with a Socialist Party left-winger named Glenn Trimble. a paper called The Labor Action, which was one of the best agitational class struggle papers in the United States in the 1930s. And he played a fundamental role in that, in a major strike of the Sailors Union of the Pacific, cultivated relations in some senses with its left-wing leader, a former Wobbly, a guy named Harry Lundenberg. And in doing this, he built up the Socialist Party. But he knew always that it would come a point when the Socialist Party hierarchy would actually move against militants doing this. But the idea was you go in, you build the Socialist Party, you show the youth, you show the militant workers that you are actually the best revolutionaries, that you are actually building their movement, that you are a part of their revolutionary activity. And then when the more conservative and right-wing leadership of a body like the Socialist Party moves against you, you fight publicly for your program, for your politics, for your principles. And in the unions and in the position on the Spanish Civil War, and in the struggles to actually defend Trotsky from slander in the Moscow trials, which were ongoing at this point, and which were, of course, eliminating the entire leadership of the old Bolsheviks who'd made the revolution of 1917. Cannon and others around him were able to win youth and militant workers to them. And so when in 1937, the Socialist Party right wing eventually moved decisively against them and across the country in action after action expelled militants and Trotskyists, Cannon and others were able to take out of the Socialist Party hundreds of activists who were young, who were embedded in trade unions, and who had years of experience. And this was the basis for the formation of the Socialist Workers' Party on January 1st of 1938. And this was the largest Trotskyist organization in the world, the most successful Trotskyist organization in the world. And Trotsky looked to Cannon, the Dunn brothers, Shachtman, and others when he was drafting the transitional program. They provided, in some senses, their activity provided something of a model for Trotsky to actually sort of write about how one functioned in the trade unions, how one functioned in mass politics, how one sort of put forward a revolutionary program in ways that could win workers and win militants to its banner. So Cannon's role, and really it's I think that one of the main contributions that I'll make in this second volume on Cannon is to show how much Cannon struggled for this politics of regrouping and rebuilding the revolutionary left in the 1930s. And I think, he stood almost alone among the Trotskyists. Musty peeled away and went back to religion. Oler drifted away into sectarianism and oblivion. Shachtman and others eventually came around to Cannon, but the seeds of an almost irrevocable split were laid over the course of the 1930s and were accentuated in some ways in this differentiation around how to approach the Socialist Party. So the lessons there are, I think, they're great. And they do relate fundamentally to our times, because I think for our times, nothing will be more important than actually regrouping the revolutionary left and doing so in a way that adheres to principles of program and fundamental positions about how to relate to mass movements, how to relate to the trade unions, how to relate to those on the left who are gravitating to revolutionary politics, but wavering in various ways and incapable of kind of finding a revolutionary road when they are immersed in other organizations that are constantly holding them back. of which, you know, the Democratic Party would be the obvious and main barrier in some senses at this point. So for Cannon, these years were difficult years, but they were years of, in some senses, tremendous accomplishment. They have never been given their adequate due in the historical writing, where the Communist Party looms large, and where there are constantly, you know, scholars and left-wingers, progressives are constantly making excuses for really the ugliness of the CP, its blunders, and its fundamentally the positions it took that were fundamentally opposed to revolutionary Marxism. What Cannon did was keep alive, in some senses, the promise of 1917, attuned to the particularities and peculiarities of its American making. And, you know, in staking out ground of what, you know, could be done in the 1930s by a limited group, the record of Trotskyism in this decade is one of amazing contributions. It was inspiring for me to hear that, you know, someone in an organizing drive was reading the book, the Teamsters book, because that book is a chapter in this larger second volume on Cannon. And the reason I actually wrote that book was that I'd finished the chapter and Occupy had kind of exploded on the scene. And Occupy, as you will all know, was differentiated. It was a mass mobilization, but it had many different currents. Some were very hostile to trade unionism and simply saw trade unionism and trade unions entirely as a captive of, you know, the 1%, and they wanted to basically break from them. Others had a far more socialist and progressive attitude towards the trade unions, and I thought that I could maybe intervene, with Occupy, with that book, and show that not all trade union struggles are led by, even when the unions are led by an ossified officialdom, can be relegated to the dustbin, and that there is a possibility in trade union work for struggling not only against capital and the state, but also against trade union bureaucracies and their sort of retrograde influence. And Cannon kept that kind of position alive. So I do think that in the current struggles, where so much is at stake, and there is so desperately a need for an alternative to the politics of the mainstream, and where the left has been basically in the doldrums for some time, that Cannon's lessons and his example are something that are not only inspiring, but that will give us as revolutionaries something to sort of bite on, and not a blueprint, not necessarily a guideline, but insights, illuminations, perspectives, and principles of which we need them desperately right now. Thanks very much.